My name is Rick Ulfik, and I'm the founder of We the World and the We campaign at we.net. Today, we're starting a three-part series called Dismantling Racism, Past, Present, and Future. In part one, we will look at dismantling racism in the past. And I just want to mention that if you are inspired to have similar conversations in your community or your circles, please tell us about it. You can email us at this address, mlk@we.net. That's mlk@we.net. Now let's bring in my dear friend and co-host for this broadcast, ShaRon Rhea, who is coordinator for We the World's Unity campaign and founder of No Judgment, Just Love at njjl.world. Welcome to the broadcast, ShaRon Rhea. And can you please give folks a bit of background about We the World's Dismantling Racism group and the whole idea behind looking at dismantling racism in the past? And let's see, you'll have to unmute.
There we go. I love these live events because I'm, adapting to the technology that isn't working at my home right now. So, hello, everyone. Rick, thank you. I am very excited to have this conversation. In our We team meetings, which usually have anywhere from 4 to 15 people attending, last year, every week following the death of George Floyd, we decided to have conversation every Tuesday with each other about dismantling racism. And it started out with Rick being so kind to let us really talk about how we were feeling. And our group is very diverse. We are international. And so we have people from the United States and from other countries who were affected by this event with Mr. Floyd. And so we got to really talk about how we felt, what was going on in our communities. And then we focused in on really what can we do to dismantle the systemic, ongoing, and increasing in some areas racism that exists in our country. And from that, we knew that the Martin Luther King event, Manifesting the Dream, 40 Days of Peace, was coming. And we wanted to really talk about racism from the perspective of Martin Luther King in a different kind of perspective. I was the one that had the idea because I find that often we use words that are total, like all and never. And those words don't really fully give us a picture of the whole thing that we're speaking about, because many things are not ever all or never. And so in speaking about racism, we all talked about the reality that some things since Martin Luther King's time have changed. Some things have gone away altogether. And so our attention is not focused on them. Absolutely, some things are persistent and consistent that is just not healthy for our country and really dangerous for people living in our country, Black people especially. And so we decided to do a three-part series where we would talk about the past, what things was Martin Luther King experiencing and the people in the 1960s that caused them to really, really shout, we need civil rights. We all are part of this country and we deserve to be treated that way. And then take that next to the current, which is what's happening now in our country as we continue to dismantle racism. And then we have a wonderful lady who's going to take on the task of helping us look into the future. So what does the future have that's a possibility for us to strive for as we are dismantling racism. So our show today is about the past. What things were there that were abominable? What things were there that have changed? And that begins our conversation, Rick.
It sure does. And how about we bring in our guest, our other guest today, Keith Miller is author of Voice of Deliverance, the Language of Martin Luther King Jr. And welcome to the broadcast, Keith.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Great to see you, Rick and ShaRon.
Hey, Keith.
Hey.
Thank you for coming.
So, yes, as ShaRon was saying, we're taking a look at what has taken place in the past. And my understanding is that you've done a lot of work looking at Martin Luther King Jr. in general, and especially his language. And of course, language and public language has so much to do with how people think of things and their attitudes and the whole culture that either supports racism or doesn't. How do you want to bring us into that conversation, Keith?
Yeah, the language is so important. To me, I see a lot of continuity with King's language and going back to abolitionism. I mean, in some ways, to me, the civil rights struggle of the 60s is a continuation or extension or revival of abolitionism. And to me, a lot of King's language in a lot of ways resembles Frederick Douglass. I actually think I Have a Dream resembles Frederick Douglass's most famous speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, from 1852. And Douglass argued that the Declaration of Independence and the statement all men are created equal means you have to get rid of slavery. He argued that the Bible affirms the humanity of all people, therefore you have to get rid of slavery. And the same argument is in King's I Have a Dream. He quotes, all men are created equal, therefore you have to get rid of segregation. He quotes the Bible, therefore you have to get rid of segregation. So I see a continuation of this argument in African-American oratory in Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, 1892. The conclusion of Ida B. Wells' most famous speech from 1892 resembles the conclusion of I Have a Dream. She also quotes, my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. So I see a continuation in this struggle, and partly because African-American orators have perfected this kind of argument, but it's also tragic that it's been necessary to be continuing to use it. So they're trying to say, you white Americans, you believe in the Bible, you believe in Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, therefore you have to get rid of white supremacy. So, and I think that I still hear traces of this argument in other people, in Al Sharpton and in Obama, for example. We still have racism with us, but it's not due to a lack of eloquence on the part of African-American orators, including King and Fannie Lou Hamer and other people of the civil rights era and going up to Obama.
And then Amanda, who just spoke at the inauguration.
Well, it's interesting. You're referring to Biden?
I'm referring to Amanda. I'm sorry, her last name is not coming.
Amanda Gordon, the one who read the the poem. Yeah, she was spectacular. You know, she's in a tradition of African-American poets who are political poets, and they're doing poetry, but there's a political element to it, including people like Audre Lorde and Maya Angelou. And there's a long, you know, that goes back to abolitionism too, but she was a very fresh voice, and I thought she kind of had everything. I loved her hair, the yellow coat, the delivery, the language. I thought she completely nailed it, and it was wonderful to see her up there with all those old people.
Yes, it was.
It was spectacular, but also Biden. You know, Biden referred to King's I Have a Dream, and he talked about the dream of justice cannot be deferred any longer, which is a reference to Langston Hughes' montage on A Dream Deferred, which King is also using in I Have a Dream in a certain kind of way as a scholar named Jason Miller, who's no relation to me, as pointed out in his book. Also, Biden quoted, Biden says, the Bible says weeping may spend the night, but joy comes in the morning. That's a line from the Psalms that King quoted quite a lot. I don't know if Biden knows that or not, or if that's just a familiar piece of scripture, but there's a lot of intertextual relationships among all this oratory and the poetry. But I thought Amanda Gordon was spectacular.
Absolutely. Keith, we're so happy to have you here as a scholar and an author and really a historian on a lot of things about and around the time when Martin Luther King was very deep and even in the beginning of the civil rights movement, because we are experiencing that again right now in our country. And the way I want to set this up, this conversation, is that there is a TED Talk called The Single Story by Chimamanda Ngozi. And she talks about being an African woman and having people judge her or view her or conclude about her a single story that they've either adopted, heard, or not really experienced fully, that she is one thing as an African woman. And I think that in this conversation that we're having in our country, where you so rightly connected President Biden with Martin Luther King, with Langston Hughes, with all of these threads of orators that are singing the same song at a different time in our country, as well as in a different way. And so we do a disservice to our efforts, in my opinion, to dismantle racism, but not recognizing that there is more than just a single story about Martin Luther King. There is more than just a single story about Black Lives Matter. There is more than just one way to interpret the progress of any movement here in our country. And so that's how I want to set up our conversation, that there are some things that are still horrific. I mean, just unbelievably abominable that are continuing to happen in our country as far as racism is concerned. But there are some things that have evolved, some things that have changed, and some things that are a non-issue that I think helps us move past that single story to be able to say, oh, well, we resolved that. We did make progress. And so those words of all and never don't really align or tell the truth.
You know, I'm so glad that you are talking about the single story concept, because for me, that is like, it's like a label. It becomes a label. And when you have a label, that's a generalization. That's sort of like, that's how people think of a person. And of course, I think of people in the system of mass incarceration, you know, like a teenager does something and suddenly that label of whatever they did becomes how that person is thought of for the rest of their lives when they're in the criminal justice system. And that's just one example. Another example of the single story for me is how the people will use a single event to characterize a whole movement, as an example, or in that vein, like if there are protests to end racism, and a tiny percentage do some kind of property damage of some sort, and suddenly that that act is then becomes the single story that is associated by some people with that movement. Oh, those looters and rioters are out there again. So the idea of a single story is really something to become aware of as we're going forward with this whole idea, right? What do you think?
I completely agree, Rick. And you're right about the prison system, incarceration, where it labels a teenager. You know, I'm a family relationship coach as well, and I work with a lot of parents that are raising teens. And teens are becoming, just like we all are, becoming who they are. And their brains have not fully developed. And we, as the adults in society, help them be in situations that are repetitive that help inform them who they are. And if we stop that natural growth of, yes, certainly be responsible for your behavior, absolutely. But there's more to a person who has been in that predicament of incarceration, especially when they're teenagers, and allow them to have more than just that single story, just like you said, Rick.
Yeah. Any thoughts about this, Keith?
You're making an excellent point. And ShaRon, that's my favorite TED Talk. This is kind of going in a little bit different direction maybe, but to me, there are a lot of stories about the civil rights movement of the 60s. There were women who complained that women were not allowed to speak at the March on Washington when King gave I Have a Dream. There were gay people like Bayard Rustin trying to stay in the closet. They tried to unite around civil rights for the most part. There were women who complained about sexism in the movement, like Casey Hayden and Mary King. So there were a lot of stories going on, but it all kind of got streamlined into one story that is more or less centered around Martin Luther King. But there are also major events in the civil rights movement, like the Little Rock 9, 1957, Lunch Counter Sit-ins, 1960, Freedom Rides, 1961, James Meredith at Ole Miss, 1962. The King was either not involved with at all or had only a very peripheral involvement. But the national memory has tended to kind of center around King, and I think Obama does that because he has contributed to that, because when he talks about the movement, he almost always talks about King, and he always talks about I Have a Dream in Selma. Mm-hmm. But you're right, Rick, about the protesters. And one of the problems with leading a protest is, what do you do with you can train all the people around you, which King tried to do in places like Birmingham, but there can be strangers coming on the side, and you don't have soldiers to keep them away. So how do you prevent a protest from turning into some direction that you didn't plan? And one of the things that some people have said is that on a protest, nobody knows totally for sure what is going to happen. And you're not sure how the police are going to react. You're not sure. So it can be very complicated and kind of messy, even if the leaders are trying to be very disciplined and very nonviolent.
Keith, I think you've hit the nail that, and both Rick, that the narrative becomes very small because that's where our pain point is, or that's where the collective memory is. And in a protest, you really don't know what's going to happen. But guess what? In life, we really don't know what's going to happen. We can only form it and guide it as best we can. And then it takes on a life of its own, and we need to be present to be able to see how to adjust it. I think, we're not having this conversation right now about how our Black community is policed, but that is another hot topic right now that I think deserves the breadth of not a single story on any side of that conversation. Because as I recall, long time ago, policemen were called peace officers. And their job was to keep the peace. And when you have that as your motivation, there's a different way of looking at people rather than officer trying to control the crowd or the person. In addition, the single story of the person that is in front of the police may have a mental health issue, may be extremely dangerous. So that's a very precarious position we have placed our officers in. So I just think the single story narrative is valuable in many of our conversations here in the United States and around the world on a number of topics. But we today are focusing on dismantling racism. And we today are going to discuss the danger of not recognizing progress of a single story around Martin Luther King. And so, Keith, it's funny that you mention the women having an issue, because I found a website that gave 5 places where the single story about Martin Luther King are just busted. And one was that women were quite involved, not only in the writing, but all of the organizing of the movement. We don't hear a lot about that. And I did see that there was a outwardly gay man in 1968 who helped organize and write the speech. And then interesting to me was Josephine Baker, who I just think was amazing. And if you don't know who she is, I invite you to look her up. But she was the one I'm sorry, not Josephine Baker, excuse me, Mahalia Jackson. She, I understand, Keith, and you can correct if I'm wrong, was the one that whispered behind Martin Luther King in his prepared speech to go off speech and tell him about your dream, Martin. Tell him about your dream. And that most famous part was improvised. It wasn't written down. And to me, knowing just that about him gives some degree of permission to people who want to speak publicly that sometimes what's just in your heart is what we really need to hear, not what you prepared 2 weeks ago.
Well, I have to disagree with you just a little bit, ShaRon, because the reason she told him that is because she had heard it before.
Exactly.
She had heard it before, so it wasn't, okay, what happened is he finished writing the speech the night before, and his lawyer handed out the speech, the prepared speech, to the reporters the morning of I Have a Dream. So the I Have a Dream part of the speech was not in the speech. Or excuse me, the I Have a Dream part of the speech was not in the speech. So people thought it was improvised. So in a sense it was, because he's jumping off the script. But he remembered it because he had used it before, and she had heard him use it before. So that's why she told him about it. She knew what he could say. She was trying to give him a cue to use something that he had used.
You're exactly right. Thanks for correcting me.
Before. There's only one that I like. It's called The Dream. It's by Drew Hansen. And he, in the last 20 years, have gotten biographies written about them, like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ruby Doris Robinson, Gloria Richardson. There's a long list. And they have gotten their biographies. They've gotten more attention from the historians. And so at the college level, they get taught a lot more than they used to be. But at the same time, I think the national memory has shrunk even more down to King, which I think is unfortunate. And the historians are trying to do their part, but it hasn't gotten back into the high school, elementary school textbooks the way that I would like to see happen. And part of the problem is, at the time, the reporters were following the movement were men, and so they thought men were leaders, so they were all following King around. So they didn't think that women were leaders, even when the women were the leaders. So
can you say that the names?
Because the reporters were a bunch of men, and they had this stereotypical assumption and a single story, and the idea that one, this great man of history. They're looking for the great man of history. So, I mean,
Can you
King was
say
important, but go
can
ahead.
you, yeah, can you say the names of those women leaders again? Just so people,
Ella
um,
Baker, who was extremely important for a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who had worked on rent strikes in Harlem and was an NAACP consultant in the South. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee people just adored her. Fannie Lou Hamer was a big firebrand in Mississippi who had an 8th grade education, African-American vernacular English. Some of the NAACP people didn't like her because they thought that she seemed too unpolished and too raw and too, but she was a spectacular orator and she could motivate sharecroppers in Mississippi to go volunteer to register to vote in a way that the NAACP middle class kinds of people couldn't do. Diane Nash was extremely important in the Freedom Rides and also in Selma. Daisy Bates was very important for the Little Rock Nine. There's a pretty, Joanne Robinson in Montgomery. Joanne Robinson started the Montgomery bus boycott. She was waiting for somebody to be arrested and Rosa Parks got arrested. She had was prepared to initiate the boycott because other people had been arrested before Rosa Parks. So there are quite a few people. So another reason they didn't get enough credit is because a lot of them, for the most part, what they did was they just wanted the movement to succeed and they didn't care who got the credit. So they weren't trying to fight over the microphone. So, and that's what you need to have a movement succeed. And it's interesting that Black Lives Matter is the leadership is very decentralized. You don't have a commanding figure who's on TV every week like King used to be. So that's a very interesting kind of development. And there's all kinds of grassroots activism going on in relationship to Black Lives Matter. It's been going on since Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, and it spread everywhere, and it really took off after the tragic murder of George Floyd. So to me, the message is that grassroots activists are extremely important. These are very ordinary, on the surface, they look like very ordinary people. They don't have to have gone to school. They don't have to be a preacher. They don't have to be in political office, and yet they can change history. Rosa Parks and Joanne Robinson, that's a good example.
I agree. And what you just described to me is the danger of the single story is that we have to have a leader for a movement. We have many leaders because there are many different audiences that some will relate to and some will not. So to value the leaders that can speak to the sharecropper or the average person today, the value of the leaders that can speak to the educators, the value of the leaders that can be in government, it's all necessary to recognize we're not just one thing in any one area. And so, Rick, did you have an opportunity to look at some of the things we identified? Like, for instance, when Keith is talking about women being very prominent, but not shown when Martin Luther King was around, mostly because it was a man's world, pretty much. And now, in order to recognize that progress has been made, Madam Vice President, we have women all over our government, all over in these movements of social change.
Definitely. So, that falls under the category of what has worked, right? The things that have actually worked coming from the past to the present. Do you want to get into that more?
Yeah, I do. Because I think it helps to reframe what we're focusing on is still an issue, hot issue of safety and equity, and in all the areas that we know exist. However, women have become amazing leaders in our country. We're in government, we're in education, we're CEOs. That wasn't really prominent at the time of Martin Luther King. Is that accurate, Keith?
All right, that's accurate. And I mean, he died in 1968, and most people would say the feminist movement more or less gets going as a public movement in about 1969, 1970. So he just missed it. One thing interesting is that his the highest ranking woman in his organization, who he worked with a whole lot, especially in Montgomery, she also came to Memphis, was named Dorothy Cotton. And one time she was interviewed, you know, in the 80s, and somebody asked her, well, would he have been a feminist if he had lived long enough? And her response was, he wouldn't have had a choice. Which I thought was hilarious. He wouldn't have had a choice. So, yeah, but it's interesting to me that African-American women like Sojourner Truth before the Civil War, she basically argued that in the speech that's called Ain't I a Woman, she argued that the struggle for racial equality and gender equality is the same struggle. They can't be separated. That's an argument Sojourner Truth made before the Civil War. So it's interesting how these things all kind of align and then get separated and then get brought back together. So in Black Lives Matter, a lot of the women, a lot of the leaders are women. So that doesn't seem to be so controversial anymore. And you're right, it's a huge step to have Kamala Harris as a vice president. And you're also right, ShaRon, a lot of things have changed. People look at George Floyd and you can think, oh my God, we're going through the 60s all over again. But there are so many African Americans who hold public office in the South in particular, who hold elective office, who are county commissioners and mayors and members of school boards and so forth. And that didn't happen before. So there has been a lot of change, despite the fact that we still have so much racism in the country. And I think part of the problem is that whites have never recognized how bad it is. Whites, they want to be in denial. They don't want to recognize how bad it is. So after King died, they sort of thought, well, we kind of passed these major bills, so now we don't have to pay too much attention.
And not just whites, but many of us, because the single story was, oh, we passed that law, so that's done. And now when all of these things are bubbling up crying for our attention, we said, but I thought we finished with that. And that's a single story that is not true, because we are uncovering way more areas that were always there, but we didn't have a national dialogue about racism in incarceration, racism in the 13th Amendment, racism in our schools, in our homes. I'm sorry, I got a little on my horse there.
You jumped on your soapbox.
I sure did.
and you know, but it made me think also of another single story that isn't true. The story that since Obama was elected president of the United States, well, that's it. Racism is over.
Exactly.
Oh, exactly, Rick. I mean, people said we're in a post-racial era. I'm going, I'm thinking you gotta be kidding me. You know, there's so much segregated housing in this country all over the place. Just to cite one thing, there's a huge income gap, there's a employment gap, education gap, health gap, police gap, incarceration gap that separates African Americans from the majority. I mean, there are huge racial inequities.
And you know, because I'm Black, and I'm of an age where I've been around many decades, and my parents and grandparents were alive when I was younger. And here's another progress that has made from my vantage point. My mom and her mom and the people of her generation were not even in their minds calling themselves anything other than colored or Negro. That was the term to define us, and some other more derogatory ones. And then we moved, when I was in middle school, to Black Power and Black American. And then we evolved to African American, and all are accepted. We have the ability to define ourselves as a people, which is progress in my mind. Yes, there are some people that wish to label us something different, but we can stand up and say, this is who I want to be referred to as. And more often than not, it's accepted and honored.
Yeah, for a while, people use the term Afro-Americans, and people realize, well, we say Mexican Americans, we say Italian Americans, we say Irish Americans, so we should say African Americans. So I think that was a step forward.
Absolutely. And you know, Keith, are you able to talk to us a little bit about the progress of literature and the progress of, prior to Martin Luther King? I'm looking to you to fill in the blank, but I don't know that there were many universal accepted narratives, authors writing, poets writing about how Black people really lived in our country and being published so the masses could read. And then now we have a prolific amount of everybody writing about everything, including Black people writing about Black people, having, different images coming to our country about what it means to live in a Black family or to be an educated Black person.
That's a great point, ShaRon. During the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, some poets like Countee Cullen, he tried to slavishly imitate European models of poetry. And Langston Hughes used blues rhythms in his poetry. So that was a change. But Langston Hughes, in a lot of his stories, he tried to present a very respectable image of African Americans. So he represented people who were very wholesome because he was trying to make the race look good. And I think there are a lot of other writers, but I think that African American literature took a certain kind of a change, I like to say, in the year 1970, because in 1970, Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, and Toni Morrison all published their first books. And their books look at the African American community and the African American family, and they're not doing protest. There's so much protest literature in African American culture. They have whites on the periphery, and the people are struggling with racism. You kind of understand that, even if the whites are not characters in the books, or they're only very, very minor characters in the books. So they're trying to explore African American families and problems in the African American families. And part of the argument is that the racism can get internalized and can damage people in African Americans, can damage their family members because they've internalized the racism and they're taking out all this frustration on each other. That's kind of oversimplified way to say it, but those writers in particular, especially Toni Morrison, who I think is the greatest American writer of all. I think her novel Beloved is the greatest American novel. She draws on Faulkner, who's so famous, but she's better than Faulkner. And I've studied a lot of American literature, and I've taught a lot of American literature. And I think race is central to the whole American experience. And I think she's way better on race than Melville or Whitman or Twain or Faulkner or anybody, any white writer. And there's also August Wilson and his plays, which won all these prizes, the 10 plays about the 10 different decades in the 20th century, with African-American characters all set in Pittsburgh, where he's from. And those plays also are looking at the African-American community and these friends and family members and how they support each other and how they sometimes damage and undercut each other. So I think that literature represents a certain kind of progress because there's a lot more complexity to it. There's more complexity to these writers than you see in Langston Hughes or even in Richard Wright or some of these other writers, and more than you see in a lot of the autobiographies, the slave autobiographies, which were basically very they were polemical, and they were trying to make an argument against slavery. So the characters are not so three-dimensional. They're trying to use their stories to support abolition.
So you're saying they were kind of made captive of the single story routine themselves, in a sense, because they knew that it was going to be interpreted as a single story.
Right. I mean, they wanted to show their humanity and to show the inhumanity of slavery, and that purpose defines pretty much what they do in the autobiographies. And why wouldn't they do that? And they also they created a form of American literature that didn't exist before. Mm-hmm. Some of the white writers were imitating Europeans too much. So I mean, they were creative in a certain kind of a way, and I give them a lot of credit. But the complexities of people like Walker and Octavia Butler is another great writer. Some of her works are protests, but they're also she's attacking white supremacy pretty directly in certain ways, but she's also dealing with complexities of male-female relationships, in particular inside African-American families.
And what about James Baldwin? And the interesting thing is that he left the United States, and was living in Europe, in France, correct?
Yes, he's brilliant. Racism drove him out of the United States. He lived in France for quite a while. A number of jazz musicians did that too. They're trying to escape the racism, and they were happier living in France, or Baldwin also lived some in Switzerland. He eventually came back to the United States because he ran out of money. But Baldwin is absolutely brilliant. In the 1950s and 1960s, to me, he's easily the best writer in America. I mean, I don't think anybody else is close. And he also did tons and tons of interviews. Mm-hmm. And he is so eloquent and so incisive. He's just brilliant, and he was a gay man too. And normally he didn't talk that much about homosexuality. He's got one novel about it that I know of. But he looked at the world in different ways. He looked at the world in different ways, and he looked at the world from the as a gay man. But like so many other people in the period, he wanted to concentrate most of his efforts on black-white issues and on getting rid of Jim Crow.
And Keith, would you align with this thought that you're bringing up for me as we're talking about literature, that along with the horrific visual of the video murder of George Floyd that produced so much around the world of different cultures, different people, different age ranges, and that to me is a different kind of marching for social equity and social justice from when Martin Luther was protesting and walking non-violently. The images that I remember were mostly men, white and black, in suits, white shirt, necktie, some women, some young people. But this, after that event, was multicultural, multi-generational, and it went on and on and on for days. And I think that not only the video, but what we're talking about in literature, that people got to have, if they saw a movie, they read a book, they had conversation in their educational spaces, they got to see Black people as people, just people having experiences like everyone else. So that horrific image on the video spoke to many people as inhumane and not separate as it had been viewed, we have been viewed over time.
Yeah, I love what you're saying there. And you're right about King. I mean, King liked to wear the black suits and a white shirt and a black tie almost all the time. And to me, he even did that when he was a student in seminary. He would go to class dressed like that because he was trying to look respectable. He's going to a largely white seminary. He's trying to look respectable. He's trying to present this, you know, sort of perfect image. And he smoked cigarettes, but there's only one photo of him smoking a cigarette. So he hid that. So people didn't know that. And he's trying to appear to be as respectable as he can. And he's got this very sort of elevated, very controlled use of language all the time. So the amount of self-discipline he had to exercise is just enormous. But you're right about the Black Lives Matter and what happened with George Floyd. There was a big outpouring over the whole world. And now people have argued that the Black Lives Matter protest is larger than the civil rights movement. There are more people who have protested. There are more people who, and you know, it's created at least some kind of a cultural shift. So race is back on the agenda again in a way that it wasn't before George Floyd, and you saw the athletes getting so involved in it, and people like LeBron James, and you know that has made a lot of difference.
So
especially the NBA, but the NFL as well.
right, and you know, this idea of the public seeing how people are treated, how blacks are treated, and thinking of them as, or let's say empathizing with them completely. We did see that with the march on the bridge in Selma, correct? So here we saw and many of those protests during that era, the America saw the dogs and the fire hoses, and that helped to create some kind of cultural shift at that point, which helped get some of the civil rights legislation in place. But then 50 years later, George Floyd, again, it's another wave of that, seeing, so all of America can relate. So, but we have, so it's kind of a repeat, but it's, I guess, in a better way now than it was then, right? It sort of relapsed at that point. Would you say that perspective of let's say white America looking at Black America?
You know, I don't know if it's better or worse. You know me, Rick, I don't like to use the better or the worse, but I think what we're inviting people to consider is there isn't a single way to look at events over history, especially as they are relatable to racism, because the things that we're talking about that have evolved and changed or not are a top focus anymore, I think are part of the reason more of the world was able to recognize the inhumanity, the murder of this person for so long. And I remember similar, without the use of electronics, images in the 60s. It didn't affect our world as universally as it did 50 years later. So I think it's important for us to really, I'm inviting people to just recognize things have evolved, things have changed, and our words like nothing or everything or never and always are do us a disservice. And exactly what you're just talking about, Rick, I think another thing that deserves to be a myth busted about the single story, that race is a Southern issue. oh no, race is a United States issue, North, South, East, and West.
Exactly. And did you want to bring in something about the loving uh, legislation?
I do. I just wondered if either one of you, Keith or Rick, had any comment on the race in our country instead of, oh, that's just for the South. I don't have to worry about that because it's just the Southern issue.
Well, Malcolm X talked about that, and Malcolm X, people would tell him, well, it's a Southern problem. I mean, mostly his territory was in the North. He gave a lot of speeches in New York, Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago. But anyway, people would tell him that, and he would say, if you live south of the Canadian border, you're living in the South. You know, and when George Floyd is murdered in Minneapolis, which is in the North, obviously, and is supposed to be a liberal city, I'm thinking, oh, I know what Malcolm X would say about this.
Yes.
You live south of the Canadian border, you're living in the South. So, and Malcolm X himself, when he was 4 years old, he and his parents and his siblings were asleep in their house in November in Lansing, Michigan, and the white supremacists torched the house in the middle of the night. So all of them had to run out of the house, including the 4-year-old Malcolm X, run out of the house in the middle of the night. And this is in Lansing, Michigan. So, I mean, he knew that it wasn't just a Southern problem. And
Exactly.
the lynchings in the 1890s, 1910, 1920, those lynchings were going on. There were more in the South, but they were going on in other places as well. And there were horrific white attacks on African-American communities in East St. Louis, in Atlanta, but also in East St. Louis, and also infamously in Tulsa in 1920.
Yep.
That were covered up, and people didn't even know that they had happened because nobody wanted to talk about it. In the case of Tulsa, they didn't want to talk about it because they didn't want Grandpa to be indicted for murder. The African Americans wanted to talk about it, and they kept track of it, but the whites tried to pretend that it had never happened.
Yes. And I think that's another thing, as I'm listening to you, Keith, that has evolved is the dialogue around civil rights is very different than the open conversation we're having about racism and equality and mostly justice. That's to me, this is not a repeat of 68. This is an enhancement to the point of realism between all of the electronics that we have, YouTube and the internet and podcasts. We're having a national dialogue filled with lots of different perspectives, lots of different history being uncovered, things being recognized that we didn't have in 1968. And that to me is an evolution of this dismantling racism conversation we're having.
That's an excellent point.
So Rick, I do want to touch on the Loving court decision because I am part of a interracial family. My former husband and I were married in 1985. And at that time we lived in New York. And we were both professionals. I was a lobbyist, he's an attorney. And yet we still had conversation. Do we want to do this? We love each other, but you know, you're white and I'm black, and we're going to bring children into the world. And how are we going to help them uncover who they are and be proud of who they are? And how are we going to deal with any backlash that comes to us? Those were the conversations we were having, but we did not engage in, we're illegal and we could be put in jail. Because believe it or not, oh my goodness, when I was researching this or saw the movie, 1968, some 20 years before, was when the United States made legal or illegal to incarcerate people who got married from different races. That's progress. We're fighting for our safety of our young Black men, any Black man, any Black person. We're fighting for so many other things, but off the table is, can we marry, at least interracially, who we love?
Exactly. And it's interesting because I remember when people were bringing the issue of gay marriage in front of the Supreme Court and, in various court, moving its way up to the Supreme Court, that idea, I think Loving was used as an example for the people talking about gay marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like building blocks, one on top of the other. Did you want to say something about that, Keith?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I love the Loving case is one of the most important in American history, and you're right, Rick. People said that an interracial relationship, the opponents of interracial marriage said that it was, quote, unnatural. So the same argument was used about gay people. If gay people want to get married, that is, quote, unnatural. It's a similar kind of an argument. So I think you're right that the Loving versus Virginia is underneath the Obergefell decision that legalized gay marriage. To me, the gay marriage decision by the Supreme Court reflects the activism of the gay community. And if there hadn't been all this activism, there's no way in the world they would have done that. And in the approximately 10 years before the Obergefell decision, which I think was 2014.
And aligning with what has evolved, improved, become a non-issue from the time of Martin Luther King to now, as we're coming up to the present, I believe this is extremely important to keep in your mind and thought that some major thing for Black people has changed and come off the table so that we can focus on the very serious issues that still exist.
So you're saying people feel free to marry the person that they want to marry now?
As it pertains to Black and white, yes. As it pertains to other people in different cultures, different genders, that's still a conversation. But our conversation here is about dismantling racism.
Right.
So Rick, did you have any, I'm on my phone, so I can't see the time.
There is no time. It's all the present.
Yes, there you go. That is true. But I have, gone through the topics that I wanted to bring up around these two governing ways we are having this conversation. One is the danger of having a single story about racism in America and where we are today versus the past at Martin Luther King. And in that danger of a single story, my ask and invitation for people who are viewing this and the three of us is to recognize, as we battle what we still need to battle, that some things have changed. And so when you engage in conversation about dismantling racism, have that in your thought. I can focus my attention on this because of the Loving decision versus Virginia, because I can identify myself however I wish, and it is accepted, different from when Martin Luther King was alive. There's literature all over the place that I can take advantage of to learn and expand my humanity to know that everybody is human and has a family that deserves to be recognized. And all the other things that we talked about, which is, like he said, Malcolm X said, if you're in Canada looking south, it's all racism there, all day, all time. But again, not all day and not all the time. Because there are places that are truly multicultural, where people feel free to be who they are. And in high contrast, there are places where that is not real life yet. So we're not done.
The work still continues, right? And so, with maybe we can, ask people to take action in some way. What is the call to action? I know from my end, I would love to see people having similar discussions with their friends, their families, their communities, and then let us know what about that, what the results are. If anyone watching this is inspired to take this conversation forward, please email us about it at mlk@we.net. And Keith, did you want to share something? I thought I heard you thinking something.
No, I'm just sneezing. You go, you keep going.
Right. But anyway, so that's my call to action. How can you watching this take this forward in your own communities?
There are lots of ways that people can do this, but you're right. The conversation needs to continue. People need to have conversations with their family members. And, I have some family members that it's hard for me to talk to. It's hard for me to figure out exactly what to say to them, but I have to work hard to try to figure out what to say. And what each of us can do is different, as you're saying, but we need to be very, very conscious that race is such an extremely important phenomenon in American life.
Right. I think that's a very important point, because a lot of times people don't really, let's say white people they want to shy away from that subject. Not all white people, but some white people want to shy away from the subject of race and would rather not bring it up. And yet it is involved in the economics of this country, the culture of the country. I mean, in so many different ways. And even in environmental racism affects people. So the environment is affected, and of course politics, all of politics. But so ShaRon, do you have anything else you're thinking about this, or do you want to kind of maybe bring it all together?
Yeah, I want to acknowledge, Rick, that we are, you and I, and now Keith, part of We, the world. And in that space, we really want to hear what kind of conversations you're having around this topic. And that when we do, we inch even closer to becoming more of a community that can have differences, that can have conversation. Like he said, it's a little challenging to know that we all matter. But when part of our house is on fire, we have to pay attention to that as well. And right now, there's a lot of fires in our house. I think the other thing is, as racism is concerned, for me, I was not alive 400 years ago. And there are things that I can acknowledge happened in my desire and motivation to dismantle racism that does not have to include responsibility for that particular action, but does include accountability that it happened and is still happening. And so if we can take out or at least recognize we're having an emotional reaction when we have this conversation because it is so inconsistent with humanity, that if we can look at it as it's not a single story and we are all part of this story. And I think having the conversation, Keith, with people that may disagree begins with not trying to change people. Live this message. And when you speak about it, speak from your own perspective and allow people to engage with you if they're ready. And that's what I got to say about that.
Well, thank you. Thank you, ShaRon, Ria, and Keith Miller. This has been fabulous. And I just want to let people know that you can sign up for the full MLK schedule, MLK Manifesting the Dream, which is We the World's program as part of MLK 40 Days of Peace, which is ending up on February 28th. So you can sign up for the full schedule, updates, and to take action, be of service yourself and with your organization. Just go to we.net/MLK. And of course, collaboration is fundamental to what we're doing with We the World and the We campaign. So to collaborate with us, you can go to we.net/partner. And then to see things that are coming up and to actually post your own events, we have a free public international calendar called Global Unity Calendar. You can go there, see that at globalunitycalendar.org. And of course, all of these things are accessible by going to we.net. So I guess the last thing I'd like to say is Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about creating the beloved community, and that is really what we is all about. So I hope you will join with We the World and all of our partners as we move from a me-based society, there's like an M, to a we-based society. And just thank you all so much.
Thank you, Rick, for hosting this. And thank you, Keith, for your knowledge and participation. I learned a lot.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you, ShaRon. It's a great pleasure, and I appreciate your inviting me.
Sure. I think we all learned a lot from you, Keith. Thank you so much.
Thank you.